Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Today's show is about science, imagination, and a little bit of madness. The kind that makes history unforgettable. Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates interview series. I'm Paul Vogelzang. We've got a fascinating guest today, David Barron, who's a science writer and author. He's here to talk about his new book, The Martians, as well as his upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation, which brings us back to a time when Mars wasn't just a red dot in the sky. It was a world of wonder, fear, and maybe even intelligent life. In the late 1800s, long before we ever sent a spacecraft into space, people believed that canals on Mars were built by aliens. Big names like Percival, Lowell, Nikola, Tesla, and others weren't just thinking about Mars, they were obsessed. They built observatories, listened for signals, and convinced the public that something or someone was out there. David Barron's new book, The Martians, tells that story with humor, insight, and real drama. It's about ambition, scientific curiosity, and how far people will go to prove a theory, even if it turns out to be wrong. We'll talk with Smithsonian Associate David Barron about what drove this obsession, why Mars captured so many brilliant minds, and how those early ideas still shape our view of space today. David Barron will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check out our show notes today for more details. But we have David Barron today, and we're going to talk about all things Mars. And yes, including Tesla's radio signals from Mars. That'll come up. It's as strange and entertaining as it sounds. You'll recognize all of these themes. It's a familiar touchstone for many of us who grew up looking to the stars, wondering what might be out there. Let's welcome our guest, Smithsonian Associate David Barron, in conversation today on our Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. Coming right up. Author and Smithsonian Associate David Barron, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Paul. Happy to be here.
Good to talk to you again. We, of course, have talked previously about American Eclipse, your wonderful book. I was telling you, I just enjoy your reading so much. You've got a new book coming out in conjunction with your upcoming appearance at Smithsonian Associates. We're going to talk about that book titled The Martians. We'll have links in our show notes so that our audience can find out more about you, your work, The Martians, all of the Smithsonian Associates work that you're doing. So good to talk to you. I hope today is a good one for you.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it'll be fun.
Good. Well, let's just start right at the start. We have talked previously, and I always enjoy our conversations. So we'll dispense with the niceties, I suppose, and we'll just jump in and tell us briefly what you're going to tell our Smithsonian Associates audience coming up, and maybe how you'll be using Zoom to engage us all, because there's going to be some beautiful images, I suspect.
Oh, absolutely. No, I've got over 100 historical images, some historical video, which of course was film at the time, some music from the era. I would say, think of my presentation sort of like a PBS American Experience documentary that I will be narrating live. It's about just a remarkable era that has largely been forgotten. This was happening at the end of the Gilded Age, the ragtime era, but this was a time when America went gaga for Mars, when before Martians were staples in science fiction, they were truly believed to be scientific fact. You could open the New York Times in 1907 and read in all seriousness about the supposed civilization on Mars. So I'll be talking about how that happened, why people got so excited, as well as the ripples that have come down to us today, how that era has changed us now and really launched us into space.
Thank you. Yeah, I just think this is going to be exciting, and I think all of your images will be wonderful to see for our audience. Again, I just want to encourage everybody to check out David Barron's upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. His new book is titled The Martians, The True Story of an Alien Craze That Captured Turn of the Century America. Let's talk about that kind of that time period, because you take us back all the way to the late 1800s. What was it that drew you there? Because I wouldn't have thought that a book about Mars could take us all the way to that point, but certainly that's where Mars mania kind of began.
Right. Well, so for me personally, it began just out of my own childhood. I mean, I grew up in the 1960s with Martians all around me and Looney Tunes cartoons. There was Marvin the Martian battling
Right.
Bugs Bunny. There was a popular sitcom in the 1960s called My Favorite Martian that my family loved. And, I've now as someone who writes about the history of astronomy, I was curious where that all came from. And it really did all begin in the late 1800s. And it because at that time, telescopes were getting good enough and large enough that astronomers could really uh, investigate the surface of the planet Mars and to start creating maps and to figure. And it seemed very Earth-like. Mars, in fact, turns on its axis in about 24 hours like the Earth. It has seasons like the Earth. And it had dark areas and light areas that astronomers assumed were oceans and continents. But in 1877, there was an astronomer in Italy named Giovanni Schiaparelli who made a very detailed map. And he, studying Mars night after night, saw these weird straight lines crisscrossing the planet. And he wondered what they were. And he figured, well, if the dark areas are oceans, then these dark lines maybe are waterways of some sort. And he called them canali, which in Italian means channels, like the English Channel, a narrow waterway. Well, that was mistranslated into English as canals. Now, people knew it was a mistranslation, and they sort of joked about canals on Mars, and I'm sure we'll get into this more later, but the theory came along that they really were canals, and that's what, as that developed over time into the first part of the 20th century, if there are canals on Mars, there must be canal builders, and that's where the whole idea of Martians came from.
And this was furthered by a man named Percival Lowell,
Correct.
kind of a new name to me. What made him so convinced that the Martians were building canals there on Mars?
Right. So, I mean, my book has really an operatic cast of characters. There are so many people who were involved in instilling this excitement about Mars in the public. But Percival Lowell is the main character, and he is quite a character. He came from one of the most wealthy and respected families in New England, the Lowells of Massachusetts, who made their fortune early in the Industrial Revolution in textiles. The city of Lowell, Massachusetts, is named after the family. And Percival Lowell, his basically all the men in the family went to Harvard. He went to Harvard and graduated in 1876. And when he left college, he had all the money in the world. He could do whatever he wanted with his life. And for the first couple of decades after graduating, he became a writer. He was quite an accomplished writer. He wrote particularly about his travels in Asia. He spent time in Japan and in Korea and was an early observer of Asian cultures. And he had sort of this fascination with, people called other cultures alien cultures at the time. And when he learned in the early 1890s about this speculation about life on Mars, he got excited about the possible alien culture on Mars. And he, as he approached the age of 40, used his fortune to build a private observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. It's still there, the Lowell Observatory, with one of the best telescopes at the time. And he dedicated himself to the study of Mars. And he very quickly convinced himself that these canals on Mars were really there. These lines were there. And he, as a highly intelligent, highly persuasive person, he was a speaker as well as a writer. He convinced himself and then the public that these lines really were canals. And I should say, not people who know about the canals on Mars often assume they were for navigation. They actually were for irrigation under this theory. Mars, as a desert planet that was running out of water, according to Percival Lowell, in order for the Martian civilization to survive, the people there, the beings there, had to take water from the polar ice caps and bring it down to their desert farms and oasis cities. And so that's what these lines on Mars were, he said. They represented a global irrigation network.
Before we get too far from Earth, let's pause for a moment. What Smithsonian Associate David Barron, author of the new book, The Martians, is showing us today isn't just about Mars. It's about belief, imagination, and how easily science and storytelling can blur. Coming up, we'll hear how one of history's greatest inventors thought he made contact with another planet. Stay with us. Hi, this is Paul. Before we jump back into today's show, I want to take a moment to recognize a truly special milestone, Smithsonian Associates' 60th anniversary. Since 1965, Smithsonian Associates, the largest museum-based education program in the world, has been inspiring lifelong learners with unforgettable experiences, connecting audiences with the Smithsonian's museums, research, and experts in new and exciting ways. This year, the celebration is for you, with a full year of special programming both online and in person, from behind-the-scenes looks at Smithsonian collections to conversations with astronauts, historians, filmmakers, and curators. There's something for everyone. Smithsonian Associates has created something extraordinary. I'm proud to partner with Smithsonian Associates to share their incredible programs with the Not Old Better Show audience. Thanks for being part of this journey. Here's to 60 years of curiosity, learning, and discovery. Our guest today is Smithsonian Associate David Barron. David Barron's a returning guest. We're talking today about his new book, The Martians, the true story of an alien craze that captured turn-of-the-century America. Just a fascinating book, and so enjoyable to talk to you. I enjoyed the book, and I very much appreciate you sharing it with me, David Barron. But I'm not the only one. The New York Times review raves. Much of the online world and community is raving about this book. The New York Times says the book is a blast to read, and they even go so far as to thank you. They say, in David Barron's true tale, reputations rise and fall, and ego distorts like a smudged lens. The Gilded Age goes mad for Mars. Life on the red planet, bosh and nonsense, said one astronomer. But according to the Martians, plenty of self-appointed experts argued otherwise. You talked for just a moment about the cast of characters, and we talked about Percival, Lowell. Let's talk about Nikola Tesla, because he has an interesting role in all of this, too. He is noted for even picking up some radio signals, I think, and we're talking to you in Colorado. I think the basis of some of this actually took place in Colorado. If I'm not correct, please correct me. But tell us a little bit about Nikola Tesla and what exactly he heard and how that really just piqued the public imagination around this.
Absolutely. And yes, that did occur here in Colorado. So Nikola Tesla, of course, was one of the great inventors in American history. He was a genius. He was responsible for creating the system of electrical power generation and distribution that we use today, alternating current. He was battling with Thomas Edison, who believed that direct current was the right answer. So in the 1890s, Nikola Tesla was a celebrity and highly regarded. And after spending so much time studying the transmission of electricity through wires, he got interested in what at the time was called wireless. Today we would call it radio. But the original idea was to transmit telegraph signals, Morse code, wirelessly. And so Tesla was a pioneer in this regard. And in 1899, he came out to Colorado and established an experimental laboratory in Colorado Springs to see how electrical signals and electricity itself could be transmitted through the air and through the earth. And this was before, so Marconi was just starting his work in Europe as well, but there was no such thing as radio as you think of it today. No one was sending out artificial signals, but Tesla would listen for natural signals. Lightning will create radio signals that he could listen to on his radio receiver, just sort of these clicks. And it was one night when he was alone in the laboratory listening to these natural sounds from the earth and the universe that he heard this very strange signal. It repeated in triplets. It was like this click, 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 repeating over and over. And he wondered what it was. And I should say, this was a time when people were speculating that there was a civilization on Mars. People were talking about how you might communicate with the Martians. And in fact, Tesla had previously speculated that you could communicate by radio and that you might do it by sending out signals that were repeated in some fashion. He actually said you might send out this series of triplets, and that's exactly what he heard.
Huh.
So he sat on the news for a good year and a half. But just as the 20th century was about to begin, New Year's Eve, 1901, right before the January 1st, 1901, he had written a letter to the American Red Cross to be read at these parties across the country. The Red Cross had these fundraisers and asked celebrities to predict what was going to happen in the 20th century and to talk about what had happened in the 19th, the great discoveries of the 19th century. And Tesla took that opportunity to say that he had received a signal from another world. And so as the 20th century got underway, the newspapers were filled with Tesla's news that he had received a signal from Mars. And so Percival Lowell had previously been talking about these canals on Mars. Now Tesla says he's received a signal from Mars. It just took off. The craze was underway. The Martians now invaded popular culture. You'd see them in Broadway plays and in vaudeville skits. There was music about the Martians. They were in comics in the newspapers, and really it was at the very beginning of the 20th century, thanks to Tesla, that the Martians took over our culture.
Yeah, I just love it. It really is just a fascinating glimpse into this time because it really revolved. There was some very stout science going on from Tesla and Percival Lowell. There was a great deal of hope around this too. As you're talking, I'm hearing that people were just buoyed by the idea that in fact this that this possibility might exist in a faraway planet. And so in that sense, it was fantastical. There was some fantasy around this. How did all of that kind of come to blend together with today's notions of space exploration and these desires to go further and farther and find potential populations and people?
Well, speaking first about what happened back then, and then I'll talk more about it today. I mean, you raised a very good point, and this is something that my book is really as much, if not more, about humans than it is about Martians, right?
Yeah.
What was it about this theory that Percival Lowell had, and the idea that Nikola Tesla talked about, having picked up signals from Mars? What was it about that captured the public's imagination? Why did people want to believe in the existence of the Martians? And that, that says a lot about what was happening on Earth. So first of all, by the late 1800s, science for several centuries had really been undermining traditional notions of faith, at least Christian faith that people had. And this idea of a God who was looking out for us in a very personal way. It was hard to see where there was room for God after Galileo and Copernicus and Newton and Darwin seemed to explain the workings of nature through natural laws. And people were feeling sort of unsettled. And here you had now Percival Lowell had presented, in essence, these deities on the planet next door. And this was something that I found surprising. I tend to think that, that the Martians would have been something scary. And in fact, H.G. Wells wrote his book, The War of the Worlds, at that time about Martians invading Earth. But that was not the commonly held view of the Martians. They were angelic. They were not demons. The Martians were thought to be better than us, more moral than us, more peaceful than us. There were pastors sermonizing about the Martians, how we should emulate them. We should be more like them. The Martians were, in essence, these guardian angels on the planet next door. There are these wonderful depictions, and I'll have some in my talk for Smithsonian Associates, of the Martians as these winged beings looking down on the Earth, keeping an eye on us. And there was a sense that if we could they were thought to be more advanced than we were. If we could get into contact with them, if we could send a signal back, thanks to Tesla, maybe we could learn from them how to live better lives. They could answer these age-old philosophical, theological questions. So people wanted to believe that there were these supernatural beings looking over us. Getting to today, clearly most of us don't believe there's a civilization on Mars. We have our rovers up there. No one's found canals. But still, there is an amazing excitement about Mars. And it's not just Elon Musk, who, of course, is the most famous person talking about going to Mars, colonizing Mars. There's actually quite a long-lived group called the Mars Society, made up of scientists and other folks who are trying to promote this idea of getting humanity to Mars and creating a new civilization there. And what do they say? What does Elon Musk say? Well, we're going to create a better world on Mars, they believe. We're going to start over. We're going to leave humanity's problems behind and create a more egalitarian, more technologically savvy, better world. Back 100 years ago, this idea of these canal-building Martians being this better civilization, of course, we were kidding ourselves. It was something we wanted to believe when we blinded ourselves to the truth about Mars. I'm very excited about the idea of people going to Mars and maybe eventually settling there. But I think once again, we're getting ahead of the facts, and we have a tendency to project onto Mars what we hope is there as opposed to what's really there.
What surprised you most in your research? What didn't you expect that you found out about this whole Martian craze?
So I grew up knowing a little bit about the canals on Mars, and I suspect that some of your listeners have heard about them.
Sure.
I'm now in my 60s. Folks my age and a little older grew up at a time when people still talked about these weird lines on Mars, and they still went by the name canals. But I always thought it was just some joke, that no one ever took it seriously, that it was always dismissed as kind of this fantasy. It was not. It was taken very seriously. Alexander Graham Bell, one of the great scientists and inventors in American history, who was one of the founders of the National Geographic Society. He was a real elder statesman of science. He, during this era, said there was no question that there was an advanced civilization on Mars. That's how deep this went. You had very prominent, respected people who bought into the idea of the Martians. That surprised me.
It's all fascinating. As you were talking just a moment ago about Musk and this idea of kind of being unsettled as a people, I was struck by this idea of ego, perhaps, maybe even some fear, and so I wonder, is that still playing a part today in our fascination with Mars? Are we a bit fearful about what might be coming? Is there some ego involved in getting there first? Perhaps some fame too? All of that existed then. Is that existing today too?
Oh, absolutely. And so, Percival Lowell was an egoist. He
Mhm.
he believed in his theory about Mars 100%, and he would, if anyone ever suggested there was any evidence countering it, he would just dismiss it immediately. And you could tell that over time, his very identity was wrapped up in his belief that he was right about Mars. And I won't give away the whole story of my book, but obviously we know there are no canals on Mars. Percival Lowell was not right. But toward the end of his life, when his ideas were really going into disfavor among scientists, he never backed down at all. To his dying day, he claimed that he was basically a persecuted genius who someday would be proven right. So there was a lot of ego back then. I've never met Elon Musk, but clearly anyone who has done what he's done must have a big ego, and he does. I mean, I think he has sort of a messianic complex. He truly believes that settling Mars is what will save humanity. And I actually think that on some level he's right, and I want to be clear what I'm saying. I don't mean to suggest that we need to go to Mars and leave the Earth behind and we can let the Earth destroy itself. On the contrary, our number one goal is to save the Earth. Mars is a dreadful place. It will be a very, very long time, if ever, before Mars is truly habitable in any comfortable way. However, if you think about it in the very, very long term, in millions, billions of years, if life is going to continue, if human life, if it still exists there at that time, is going to continue, we're going to have to spread out from Earth eventually. Something will happen, whether it's an asteroid striking Earth or the sun engulfing the Earth, eventually the Earth will not be habitable. Again, it's not going to happen anytime soon, but someday we're going to need to figure out how to get to Mars. And Elon Musk believes he's the person who's going to start getting us there. And who knows? He might be the one who does.
I always enjoy talking to you. So I've come up with a couple of what I call rapid fire questions, David Barron, to just kind of get your sense real quickly as to kind of, some responses about maybe the fact or fiction lines that sometimes are blurred. And I want to ask you a question about who might win a debate, a science fiction writer like H.G. Wells or Nikola Tesla or Percival Lowell? Who's going to win that?
Gosh, I guess it depends what the debate's about. But I mean, H.G. Wells and Nikola Tesla, that would be really interesting. I think Wells would win because H.G. Wells was famously pessimistic, and he was a cynic about human nature. I mean, that comes across in The War of the Worlds, which actually was really a statement about the evils of colonialism. I mean, what the Martians were doing to humans is what the British had done to some of their colonial subjects, in a sense. But Nikola Tesla, on the other hand, was very much an idealist, and I think was very naive about human nature. I would hope that Nikola Tesla and his better view of humankind was the one who would win the day, but I fear that it's H.G. Wells who would win a debate.
Okay, which planet gets more hype than it deserves, Mars, Jupiter, or Earth?
Oh, I'm sorry to say this. I think it would have to be Mars. I mean, I love Mars. There's a lot to be excited about Mars, but the hype does get a little out of control, particularly this idea that we're going to start living there anytime soon. Mars is a dreadful, dreadful place. I mean, Mars wants to kill you. It's dreadfully cold, and there's hardly any atmosphere there. You'd have to wear a pressurized suit as well as breathing oxygen. They have global dust storms there. The soil is toxic. Living on Mars would be exceptionally hard, and I think this vision we have of there's a lot of science fiction showing people, astronauts going to Mars. There's talk of terraforming Mars, turning it into a second Earth. That's going to be so much harder than we think. I think Earth deserves more hype. Earth is a wonderful planet. We don't know any other planet in the universe like it. But I do love Mars. It just sometimes gets a little overhyped.
Final question for you, David Barron. We so appreciate your generous time today, but I wonder, you have one night with a telescope from 1894. Where are you pointing that telescope? What are you looking at?
Oh, wow. Well, maybe it's an obvious answer, but it's Mars. But I'll say, and the telescope I want to be looking through is Percival Lowell's in Flagstaff, Arizona, because 1894 is when he established his observatory. When he started to look through the telescope, and he began to see the canals on Mars. And I would love to. So in 1894 was an important year because Mars made an especially close approach to Earth that year, so it was easier to see through the telescope and to make out any potential lines on the planet. Percival Lowell saw the lines. I would like to see if I might spot them. Actually, in the course of doing my own research, I went to the Lowell Observatory. At a time when Mars made an especially close approach to Earth. And I looked through Percival Lowell's telescope to see if I could spot the canals. But gosh darn it, there was one of these global dust storms on Mars at that time. And so the entire surface of Mars could not be seen. It was just this great big rust-colored ball through the telescope. But in 1894, there was no dust storm. So I would love to be back there with Lowell looking through his telescope and seeing if I might see what he saw.
All good stuff. David Barron, award-winning journalist, broadcaster. We've talked before to Smithsonian Associate David Barron about American Eclipse. He's written the new book titled The Martians, The True Story of an Alien Craze That Captured Turn-of-the-Century America. New York Times is raving about it. It's wonderful. I just can't recommend it enough. I also can't recommend enough David Barron's upcoming presentation at Smithsonian Associates. We appreciate your time today. Thank you again for being so generous and talking to us about this wonderful subject, the Martians. I look forward to talking to you again, David Barron. I always enjoy it. Good luck with everything that you're doing. Please stay in touch with us.
Great. Paul, always fun to talk to you. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. Of course, that was Smithsonian Associate David Barron, who will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. David Barron is the author of the new book, The Martians. He reminded us today just how far curiosity can take us, sometimes to great discovery and sometimes into the unknown. David Barron's story of the Mars craze at the turn of the 20th century is not just about science, but about wonder, ambition, and the human need to find meaning in the stars. Whether or not there were Martians building canals up on Mars, what matters most is how deeply people believed it and how that belief changed history. In our conversation today with Smithsonian Associate David Barron, hopefully it sparked your interest. There's plenty more to explore. You can find this episode along with all of our full archives of Smithsonian Associates interviews at notold-better.com. Follow us on social media. We're on Twitter at notoldbetter and Instagram at notoldbetter. You'll find updates, photos, behind-the-scenes extras, all of this from Not Old, Better Show Smithsonian Associates interview series. It's a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelsang. Thanks for spending time with me today. Be well, be safe. Let's talk about better. The Not Old, Better Show Smithsonian Associates interview series on radio and podcast. I hope you'll join me again next time.